So thank you all for being here. If you're sort of new to our work, I'm going to give you a quick background on the Roosevelt Institute and the Roosevelt Network. The Roosevelt Network is the sort of largest student policy organization across the country. We work with students on 120 college campuses in 38 states. The role that we provide is helping students to write and advocate for the policies that they're interested in. We believe that there's a severe gap where students are asked for their money and they're asked for their time, but very few people are asking students actually to contribute their ideas. That's where we think the Roosevelt Network plays a critical role. We've been around and doing this for the last 12 years and have had sort of a series of successes that I'd love to talk to you about in the future. But I'm hoping you know a little bit about us, which is why you hopped on. So thank you so much for joining us. The piece of our work that we're going to talk about today is a new project that we launched earlier this year called the Republic Project that's focused on rebuilding the public good agenda. Really, our thinking here was that with the incoming administration and the ways in which it is likely to take on sort of the distribution and the allocation of public goods, it's very important to have organizations and people that are standing up and consistently thinking about the importance of public goods, be they education, water, transport, infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. That's really why we took on this project. We believe this has been a long-term trend that's really likely to be exacerbated by this administration, and we believe it's really, really important to strike at the heart of it right now to both try to build local policy solutions that help counter the trend that's moving forward and to help build this narrative that things and institutions owned in the public good can remain positive. Privatization is not always the best, or is not always the best structure by which to allocate the public good. To do that, we've been doing a few things this summer. We have a group of our students, and if Republic Incubator students you are on here, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We have a group of about 10 student projects across the country that are starting to build their own policies on how to combat privatization or how to improve the public good in their communities. And the second thing which we've been doing, which you're a part of today, is thinking about how to continue and push this conversation further. That's why we're here today to talk about privatization and the untold story of declining worker power. We believe that pro-privatizers often push an argument that's bound in consumer choice, but often that argument hides the fact or hides the workers that are behind the production of public goods. And the key public goods that we rely on were actually built by a series of workers and continue to be maintained by a series of workers. Displacing public workers from these narratives then is a very, very dangerous thing. And so we're here to talk about how has this happened and how do we make sure that in the future, as we think about the public good, we continue to place workers and their interests at the center of that conversation. I'm very excited about the 4 panelists that we have on. I think they each represent a really, really important part of this conversation, and my hope is that they will all meld together very, very well. You will find out if that is true in the very near future. Let me start with David Dayen. David Dayen is a contributor to The Nation, The Intercept, and The American Prospect. He's also the author of Chain of Title, How 3 Ordinary Americans Uncovered Wall Street's Great Foreclosure Fraud, which is the winner of the Studs and Ida Turkel Prize. David, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Oh, thank you, Amal.
Our second panelist is Marshall Steinbaum. Marshall is a fellow and research director at the Roosevelt Institute, where he researches market power and inequality. He works on tax policy, antitrust and competition policy, and the labor market, in particular, declining entrepreneurship and labor mobility, as well as credentialization and its result, the student debt crisis. His work has appeared in Democracy, Boston Review, The New Republic, the Industrial and Labor Relations Review, and Pro Market, and many, many other places. Marshall, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Our third panelist is Sam Nelson. Sam is an organizer at Jobs with Justice. He began organizing in college with the George Washington University Progressive Student Union. There he was involved in helping to organize solidarity campaigns with construction and dining hall workers on campus. From 2012 forward, he's been a DC Jobs with Justice Coordinating Committee member representing SLAP. He's also been involved in campaigns against Walmart, Verizon, student debt, and Sodexo. Sam, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And our fourth panelist is Haley. Haley is a recent graduate from the University of Tennessee, where she studied journalism and public policy. She's currently working with Roosevelt's Republic Incubator to develop an action plan to combat privatization at her alma mater. I've had the pleasure of working very, very closely with Haley for the last couple of years. It's a pleasure to have you on, Haley. Thank you for being here.
Hi, thank you.
All right, great. Now that we've done what I always think are pretty awkward introductions for all of you, I know how much people love having their bios read out loud in front of a large room. Let's move into what I hope will be a more exciting part of this, which is actually some of the policy conversation. So, Marshall, why don't we start with you? I'd love to hear from you a little bit about how the histories of union busting or dismantling collective bargaining and privatization have been tied together, and in what ways has some of these shifts in the workplace helped to create the conditions that have led to privatization?
You're on mute.
Oh,
Excuse me, sorry about that. I was on mute by mistake. When I think about the history of privatization, I tend to start with the civil rights movement, because I think that the privatization that we started to see in this country in the late 60s and 1970s was really a backlash to the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was about gaining control, integrating the public sector, gaining control, gaining input for diverse communities, and I think that was deeply threatening and engendered a backlash that really eroded the idea of public goods that operated in the public interest. And the way in which that led towards privatization and the erosion of collective bargaining was essentially that we developed this ideology of waste, fraud, and abuse as endemic to the public sector, and the collective bargaining contracts and labor agreements that had been developed within the public sector, in part as part of the civil rights movement, came to be seen as creating this sort of unwieldy bureaucracy that didn't really serve the public so much as it served the people who worked in public sector institutions. And that view, that ideology of waste, was extremely racialized from the beginning, and created the sort of backlash politics that we saw unfold in the 60s and 70s. So I'm thinking in particular about tax revolts that happened starting in the late 60s and leading into the end of the 1970s at the local and the state level, where you had local communities essentially voting down school board passed budgets on the theory that they were being taxed too heavily to pay for a bloated and inefficient public service that was not benefiting the clients as much as the people who worked within it. That happened at the same time as a national an inflationary crisis, in which a part of the thinking about what caused it was that there were collective bargaining contracts that built in raises for workers that kind of automatically prolonged this inflationary crisis. So if we had an increase in prices, then those contracts meant we would have an automatic increase in wages, and consequently firms would need to increase prices more to their consumers in order to pay for that increase, and so on, in a vicious cycle. And all of those kind of elements of the politics of the backlash to the civil rights movement, it created a narrative whereby the public sector was more of a threat, and specifically collective bargaining and labor rights in the public sector was considered a cost to the economy and to society, and one that could potentially be tamed by, first of all, restricting the scope of what the public sector would do at all through privatization, and this narrative of waste, that even where something was a public function in some sense, it could still be more efficiently provided through outsourcing, where you would break existing labor contracts and collective bargaining agreements in order to have private firms provide that service more cheaply and without the waste.
Fantastic. Thank you, Marshall. I think that really sets us up. Let me actually zoom into one of the specific pieces that you mentioned, particularly around sort of racialized history of privatization and the ways in which some of this had a lot to do with the profile of public sector employees. David, as somebody that's regularly sort of working with, interacting with, writing about sort of public employees, I'd love to ask you about who are the employees that are most affected by privatization? What is the profile of public employees writ large?
Sure, sure. Well, thanks for having me on this webinar. Excited to be here and part of this conversation. When you talk about who is affected by privatization, I want to make a few different points. Number one, obviously, workers in the public sector, including teachers, corrections officers, government employees who manage and provide public services, postal workers, our second largest employer outside of Walmart. All of those workers are affected, but also, contracted workers are affected. And this might sound a little odd, but, for example, on road projects, the construction is almost always done by private contractors, but there's a difference between whether the municipality or the state is in control of the project or a private firm. I mean, if you have a private firm that is managing the project, they need to generate a layer of profit and deliver the project at a certain cost below what the public sector can bring it in for, and almost always that means that labor costs are getting squeezed. So, it actually crowds out the workers at contracted firms that have been doing the work well for, managed by the public sector for many years. And obviously, if you have private contractors who come in and realize these huge gains and profit margins off of that labor, it's gonna make it very difficult for these other, these various contractors who do the work for the municipalities to succeed. So it's almost like the privatizers are pushing out the contractors who were just doing this for the public sector. And what we do know is that this is devastating on workers. Here's an example from Food and Water Watch. They looked at 10 water system outsourcing deals and found that over time, 1 in 3 jobs are lost, usually through attrition. And that's the key characteristic, too, that I want to mention, is that the impact on workers might not be felt right at the beginning. There may be some language in the contract that for the first year, or the first 2 years, that workers are protected in some way or another. But over time, vacancies aren't filled, promotions aren't given, pay raises aren't given. And that means, fewer people to respond to maintenance, fewer people to respond to customer service, more disgruntled employees, if no raises are being given, then people might be more likely to leave, and it just leads to this attrition over time. And as far as who public sector workers are, I mean, it's pretty clear that we know that they're disproportionately African American and disproportionately female. There are a lot of different studies on this using federal government data, but I think the consensus number is something like African Americans making up about 20% of the government workforce, at least at the federal level. And I think it's pretty similar at the state and local level as well. And that's compared to African Americans making up about 10% of all private sector workers. There's one study out of the University of Berkeley Center for Labor Education that says that for Black workers, the public sector is their largest employer. And for Black women, it's number 2. So certainly, people of color are far more affected by privatization than white workers writ large. So this component that Marshall was talking about continues to be present to this very day.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. Yeah, I think so. So one of the things I would like to do before we go back to Marshall for a minute is get a sense of sort of where our audience stands. And I think we've already talked about a few very, very big pieces. I think both David and Marshall have talked about sort of how this might have impacts on the racial wealth gap, employment thought of racially and gender, and sort of from a gendered fashion. One of the key things that sort of is a driving part of the privatization agenda is the argument that pro-privatizers are able to offer more fiscally efficient services than government is. So I know Marshall has a view on this, and I'm very excited to hear it. But before we get to him, I want to see actually what folks think about this question. Do you think, and there's a poll up on your screen now, do you believe that private firms are able to offer public goods at lower cost than the public sector? You can say yes, no, depends on the good in question, and other. As much as possible, please answer very, very honestly without taking the bias of the presenters or myself into account. Just going to give you another minute. Okay, so let's have a look at what people think. So the overwhelming group in the audience believes that it is entirely dependent on the good in question. The sort of private firms are not able to offer public goods at lower cost than the public sector is second in question. Of course, I will preface this by saying the cost of service is not the only or even the most important necessarily metric when considering whether we should offer something in the private or the public good, but I think it provides an interesting sort of jumping off point. Marshall, I know I did not tell you I would be conducting a poll, so I apologize for sort of throwing you in with that. But let me ask you, so this argument that pro-privatizers have that they are able to offer more fiscally efficient services than government, what's the basis of that argument? How would firms be able to provide equivalent services at cheaper costs if we were to use sort of the narrative and the ideas that they're putting forward?
Unmute.
Thanks. Sorry. Thank you. I think the way this argument usually plays out is that the pro-privatizers will say that the public sector is inefficient in part because it's inherently political. So they'll point to a statement similar to the one that Aman just made, that cost is not necessarily the most important consideration in determining how a good should be provided. And if you hear a statement like that through the lens of that, you're already in favor of privatization, then you think, okay, well, all I care about is how efficiently we can provide this good, or maybe there's other things that matter in the world, but if I'm a public servant whose ultimate responsibility is to taxpayers as voters, then it's not my job to care about other considerations. I will just represent that singular interest. And in that case, publicly provided goods where collectively bargained contracts are already in place and providers have some degree of power or rights that are already written into those contracts, it would serve the interests that I care about most as a public official to privatize that service, to break those contracts. In particular, we've seen this in both the private and the public sectors in recent decades, the end of the erosion of the statutory employment relationship. So under labor law, under employment law, there's a definition of what it means to be an employee, and the premise of that law is that if you are an employee, you have to do what your boss says, basically, and in exchange for doing what your boss says, you are entitled to some benefits of entering into that relationship. So the easy way to summarize this would be to say, with control comes responsibility, and those responsibilities take the form of, say, employer-provided health insurance, or retirement, or maximum hours worked, paid leave, that sort of thing. In some cases, they're not written into contracts in writing that are signed, but they're sort of built up over over the course of time through expectation, and the employer can basically say, well, wait a minute, I can get just as much work out of this employee without having to provide the benefits that I've been providing if I outsource. So what that means is, instead of just directly hiring this person, I will contract with a private labor company in many cases, or just a private, say, in the case of construction, as David was referring to, I'll hire a private construction firm. That construction firm, if they don't have to deal with statutory employees, let alone unionized employees, but rather can sort of hire people on a day-to-day basis, then they don't have to provide the same level of salary and the same level of benefits, and they will pass that savings along to the public in the form of low bids on contracts or just lower cost of providing services. So there's altogether the ideology of waste that I referred to before. Kind of the analog to that is, well, if we just get as much of these public services out of the public sector as possible, where there's all these obligations that are built up over time, whether in writing or not in writing, put that in the private sector where you have an efficient auction mechanism or some sort of market-based bidding on the basis of cost, then the lowest cost provider will win the contract, and we will have saved the taxpayer a lot of money. And I think that general kind of thought about how it is that privatization saves money, and saves money specifically by eroding collective bargaining relationships, has been very powerful. I should also say, sort of speaking, I guess, more directly politically, that this erosion of the statutory employment relationship has definitely been a feature of the labor market over the last several decades, and I think politically it's been very effective to then go to the taxpayer as a public official and say, these employees, these public employees, they have a very generous defined benefit pension, or they have very good health insurance, or they get to retire at an age that sounds like they should still be working based on this contract, whereas you work in the private sector, you taxpayer, and you don't have access to any of those nice goodies that these public sector employees have. So maybe you should support my bid to privatize those public services, because you're paying for a much sweeter deal for these workers than you yourself are getting as a worker yourself. I think that kind of political pitch coming from the pro-privatization movement in politics, so to speak, has been extremely effective.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think there's many of us that can see echoes of that statement that you just made in light of sort of both the presidential campaign, but many local campaigns, definitely in the last couple of years, obviously far beyond that, but that narrative is absolutely something that remains very strong. David, I think one of the things that would be helpful to draw on from your experience is a little bit of a walkthrough of how does this privatization process actually work, and I think Marshall started to build a little bit of that in terms of some of the big sort of changes and some of the big advantages that city employees sometimes see, or city officials sometimes see, in terms of sort of shifting the statutory employment relationship. But it would be really helpful to walk through, what does this actually look like? What are the key stages in a process like this?
Sure. I would start by just building on what Marshall said. Another reason why city leaders are enticed by privatization in many cases is that they get some upfront funds in exchange for selling off an asset for many decades, and that enables them to use that money for economic development, for building a new highway, for whatever it is. And somebody else has to deal with the aftermath. They're not there in 20 years when this becomes a problem, that a private company owns all the parking meters in Chicago, or that a private company owns this highway connecting two major cities in Texas. So that is a key reason why city leaders are enticed by this. Many cities are budget strapped. They're looking for a way to fund their campaign promises, frankly, and privatizers dangle that money in order to get an equity stake in something that is a public good. So there are many different types of privatizations you can do. We're going to hear from Haley about outsourcing, which is not necessarily giving up the asset itself, but outsourcing the provision of operations or maintenance to a private firm. There's things called public-private partnerships, which involve the public sector giving an equity stake in a certain road building project or other infrastructure project to a private company who then has certain concessions and the ability perhaps to extract revenue in the form of user fees out of that particular project, whether it's toll roads or bridges or bridge tolls, things like that. And then there's just selling the asset off entirely, and we see that as well. I already referenced the case of the parking meters in Chicago. So we see a number of these different kinds of things. Sometimes they say, we're not privatizing, we're engaging in a public-private partnership, or we're not privatizing, we're just outsourcing the maintenance. But they lead down the same road, and they're very similar in their operation. I'll give an example. I've written about the Tennessee issue, so I'm going to leave that to Haley, but I'll give you the example of something I wrote up recently in a recent piece for The Nation around a water treatment plant in North Miami Beach, Florida, which serves about 200,000 homes around South Florida, not just in North Miami Beach, but North Miami Beach controls the asset. And they hired an outside consultant to assess the plant, and the consultant found what they called decades of neglect, even though the system had won awards in the past for water quality. The consultant recommended outsourcing operations and management off to the private sector. As I said, this is sort of one type of privatization. The city had allowed this neglect to occur. They had cut funding for many, many years. But their solution was essentially to blame the workers and saying that, no, we need, whoever was managing this plant before, we need to kick them out. We need to get a private firm in there who can do it more efficiently. That's at least the pitch. And after that, the city set out a request for private firms to come in and make their case to take over the project. In this case, sometimes they call this a request for proposal. In this case, it was called a request for qualifications. In other words, the private firms had to sort of give their qualifications for why they would be better suited to take over this project. And this one was very unusual because usually the whole idea behind privatization is that you have a bidding process, an auction process, as Marshall said, between the firms so that you end up getting the lowest price as a municipality. But in this case, the city just exclusively negotiated with the firm that they rated #1 in qualifications. It was a company called CH2M Hill, who was already under contract with the city, involved in the assessment of the plant, and even wrote the master plan of the plant. And this company that was instrumental in recommending the outsourcing was first in line to get the contract. And we see these kinds of, sort of self-dealing things happen from time to time in this privatization. So after there was this negotiation process with CH2M Hill, they reached an agreement. And then there was a vote of the city council, and the city council voted through that project in May. All of the workers had to reapply for their jobs. There was some language in the contract that they would be able to, protect these workers in some way, but the contract plainly calls for $2.4 million in annual savings in labor costs starting in year 2. So the first year might be good, and then when everybody looks away, they start making the cuts. And these kinds of riders to mandate labor savings are pretty typical. The city, sort of hides behind this promise that nobody's going to lose their jobs, but again, they can lower staffing levels through attrition, they can change benefit packages. They've already acknowledged that they'll shift workers from a defined benefit pension to a like-minded defined contribution 401k plan. They made an equivalence there between the two and said that meets their mandate in the contract for a promise of no reduction in benefits, no reduction in jobs. So and in this case, the workers were unionized. They were part of the ASME union, and they've been operating without a contract for a couple years, and so they could lose benefits associated with that contract immediately when they go off to a private firm, which would be a non-union situation. So that's an example of one privatization. This is particularly outsourcing of operations and management. There are plenty of examples, and I could probably spend the rest of the next hour talking about them, but I think I'll stop there and we can hear some from our other panel.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. And I think for folks that have seen the latest version of sort of the or any version of the Trump infrastructure plan, I think you'll see asset recycling as one of the key factors in there that goes to exactly what David and Marshall mentioned in terms of the ways in which people are incentivized to, or city level government is incentivized to sell off short-term assets as a way of sort of bringing in revenue in the short term without thinking through long-term ramifications. I want to stick with, well, so before I turn to Haley, I do want to say, folks that are joining us, thank you so much for your questions. We already have a good list of them. We are tracking that space and do have a good list that I will be bringing up very soon. So please keep sending in your questions. Moving along with this train of thinking about some specific privatizations, let's turn to you, Haley, and let's talk a little bit about what's going on in Tennessee. Can you talk about Governor Haslam's privatization plan in Tennessee? How was the plan proposed? How was it moved forward? What are some of its potential impacts?
So thank you, Juan, and thank you, David. David has a really good article on the situation in Tennessee at The Intercept, so y'all should go read that. For the past 2 years, Tennessee's Governor Bill Haslam has been pushing this plan to privatize the management of nearly all state facilities. So that's including state universities, state parks, prisons, armories, hospitals, basically any state facility you can imagine. Governor Haslam is actually the richest elected official in the nation, if we're not talking about Donald Trump. And he has a net worth of about $2 billion. And he's continued to push this plan despite widespread protest from across the state. United Campus Workers, which is the statewide union, estimates that this plan could impact the jobs of about 10,000 state workers if it's fully completed. And it's kind of interesting that you asked about how the plan was proposed, because it wasn't really publicly proposed by the governor's office. We wouldn't have heard about it, and it wouldn't have been public unless the Campus Workers Union had pushed for that information to become public. So it became public in August 2015. And for the past 2 years, a coalition of organizers from across the state have been fighting the plan. And in May of this year, the contract was actually finalized between the state and the company that ultimately got it for a 5-year contract, which is worth up to $1.9 billion. The contract was awarded to Jones Lang LaSalle, which is a Chicago-based company and one of the largest managers of real estate in the country. And it's not a company with a great track record. About 10% of Tennessee's state facilities are actually already run by JLL, and there have been kind of disastrous results. Under the current contract, which is just a few buildings in Nashville, 126 state workers received just 60 days notice that they would be losing their jobs, and only 37 of them were ultimately rehired by JLL. A 2013 audit was conducted by the Tennessee Comptroller's Office, which found that JLL stood to gain from at least 2 of its own multi-million-dollar recommendations to the state. And JLL's contract with the state had been gradually increased from like a relatively simple $1 million contract to a $10.7 million contract without any new rebidding process. And JLL's smaller contract in Nashville, people started noticing that the quality of service in those Nashville buildings immediately went down when JLL came in. On top of all of that, if that wasn't enough, Haslam, when he was running for office a few years ago, disclosed that he had a major investment in JLL. His investments are now in a blind trust, but the fact is that we don't know if he stands to gain from this contract with JLL, and that in itself is incredibly concerning. At my own school, University of Tennessee in Knoxville, we outsourced our custodial services for several years until bringing them back in-house in 2012. Administrators, when we did bring things back in-house, noted several benefits of insourcing, including increased service, better coverage, better cleaning, and more responsiveness to the needs of the university. And insourcing was also better for workers, and it led to better training, career paths for workers, and better benefits packages. So my university decided to bring things back in-house in 2012, and it took fully 2 years to bring things back in-house. And now, just a few years later, our state government is trying to get us to outsource again after making this decision to bring things back in-house. And this outsourcing process at the state level has been just mired in secrecy and a complete lack of transparency. Early on in the process, reporters put in records requests for more information about the process, and the governor's office responded by telling staffers to avoid discussing the issue over email. The governor's office has put out 2 open records periods so that Tennesseans can submit comments on the outsourcing process. So thousands of Tennesseans have submitted comments to that open comment period, but there has since been no response from the governor's office. On top of this, so the state is actually using a process called vested outsourcing, which is something that was created by 2 Tennesseans, one of whom is actually working in the governor's office on this outsourcing plan right now. Vested outsourcing actually gives corporations a bigger voice in contract negotiations. So essentially, JLL got to help create and write its own contract. And this out-of-state corporation had an equal seat at the table in these like confidential discussions, whereas Tennesseans, taxpayers, and the state workers who are going to be the most directly impacted didn't have any seat at the table. So the governor's office has now signed this contract with JLL, and they claim, David was talking about this a little bit, they claim that they will be able to save millions of dollars through outsourcing, but that they're going to also protect the livelihoods of current state employees. That's a claim that they've made over and over again. But from different institutions like University of Tennessee, which is already being run very efficiently and already runs several million dollars under budget every year, the only way to really save any money through outsourcing will be to slash benefits, cut wages. And it might just be a few years into the contract where we'll start seeing this, but at some point JLL is going to have to make a profit somewhere. So yeah, those are the things that are at stake with this plan, and a little bit of the background of what has been happening for the past 2 years. What's at stake is the treatment and the livelihoods of workers, and the impact of sending thousands of local dollars to an out-of-state corporation, and really the loss of accountability and control over nearly all of our state's public facilities. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it there. I could talk a lot more about it.
Yeah, thank you, Haley. And for folks that are interested in how sort of these plans of outsourcing are put forward, I would recommend, and we're happy to send on some of the resources of what this vesting outsourcing model is and how it's being described. I'm sure there's a lot of folks on the call who are very concerned, as Haley said, with corporations getting to have a bigger voice in outsourcing. So for all of you that are really concerned about that, vested outsourcing is definitely the way forward on that front. I do want to say also that this plan is something that sort of David, Haley, Sam have all played an integral role in helping to build an opposition for. But this is a very strange room where sort of 3 or 4 people have been heavily involved. This has been such a secret process that it's taken very, very long in the work of people like David to get this story out there. Sam, let me turn to you, because I think at think tanks we're often very, very good at raising a bunch of the issues and then closing the conversation. But I'd love to talk about what are some potential solutions, what are the ways to move forward. Can you talk about some of the ways in which Jobs with Justice has helped to build worker power through local organizing, and in what ways do some of those campaigns intersect with racial and gender justice as well?
Yeah. It was awesome to hear that other people were talking about Tennessee, because I'm usually the only one in the room. So Jobs with Justice, we have 37 community labor coalitions all across the country, and we really have a kind of analysis of worker power that centers on collective bargaining, and that we can build worker power by expanding the right to bargain, and also expanding how you can bargain and what you can bargain over. And so we do that through kind of 2 things. One is what we call bread and butter. It's solidarity mobilizations, building out that community arm of a union fight, of a contract fight, of a wage theft, however you want to see it. Being able to bring in those other elements that people might have overlooked. And then our campaigns, which range from a new kind of union drive that we've come up with. We're looking at logistics right now, to something like policy fights. So one of our big policy goals is scheduling in hours, what we call just hours. And so we see like a scheduling and policy fight with non-union retail workers as essentially those non-union retail workers through this campaign bargaining over their scheduling and hours at their location. The example of the Tennessee workers, the campaign that they waged, which their union doesn't even have bargaining rights formally, they are essentially bargaining over the terms of a government restructuring. So that's how we kind of look at building power at the local level, is how can we expand bargaining and how can we bargain in different kind of ways. And then how it incorporates racial and gender justice. We've made a real committed effort over the past year or 2 years or so to kind of focus on how we're challenging white supremacy in our organizing and how to center racial and gender justice specifically. So the scheduling and hours campaigns, you know, retail workers are much more likely to be people of color, much more likely to be women. And so increasing the bargaining power of these heavily feminized and people of color industries means those communities can have more stability and can have more autonomy in their lives. And then as both Marshall and David have gotten into, public sector jobs, they're good because they were created from a public sector workers movement that was led by Black women, but led by people of color. So our solidarity work with groups like the Grand Alliance to Save Our Postal Service, the defeating the charter school cap ballot petition in Massachusetts, they're having a very direct impact on women and people of color who already have a weakened bargaining position in society. And then just on our immigration work, we're really seeking to how can we have undocumented workers bargain as well. And so bargain over the terms of their deportation, saying that, you know, deportation is a form of retaliation. And we do that through our various campaigns and our rapid response work in a number of cities, including Buffalo.
Fantastic, Sam, and I want to hear a little bit more about sort of some of the campaigns that you all are already waging. Let me go back to Haley first for a minute to talk a little bit about the coalition in Tennessee. How has the coalition been opposing privatization within the UT system that you've talked about, and what are the types of actions that the coalition has taken on? Haley, I know you have a few slides here, so just let me know as you want me to switch from one to the next.
Okay. Yeah, so there has been an incredible amount of opposition to Governor Haslam's plan across the state, despite how much lack of transparency there has been. The Campus Workers Union has been an incredible force in this fight. They created a coalition called Tennessee's Not for Sale, which includes state workers, campus workers, university faculty members, students, and community organizers, as well as lawmakers. The coalition has planned a lot of protests, a lot of rallies across the state, as well as at the state capitol in Nashville. At one point, they even unfurled this huge paper petition with thousands of signatures from Tennesseans, like in the state capitol. And thousands of Tennesseans have signed petitions. They've written editorials and submitted comments on that public comment period opposing this plan. So on that slide, you can see just how much opposition there is to this plan, just across the board. There was a 2016 Vanderbilt poll that found that 68% of Tennesseans want the state to continue managing facilities. That's a huge amount of Tennesseans who just actively oppose this plan. A couple other actions that have been taken, student government associations representing different UT universities all passed resolutions opposing privatization, which is huge because this privatization plan will make about 70% of it is made up of universities across the state. And Tennessee is a red state for sure, with a Republican supermajority in the state house. But state lawmakers on both sides of the aisle have spoken out against privatization. 42 state lawmakers sent a letter to the Office of Customer Focused Government, which is a real office in our state government, asking to halt this outsourcing plan until the legislature could study its implications. In the legislature, 2 bills were introduced in this past legislative session that would increase legislative oversight during this plan. They were introduced, but the governor announced his opposition to the plan for philosophical reasons, and both of those bills were sent to summer study. I included this picture of Governor Haslam. This is me and then a fellow Roosevelter. We caught him at this rally at one point and asked him like point blank, what is happening with this privatization plan, just because it has been such a secretive process. And his answer was pretty telling. He said, what plan? Just kind of jokingly, but it really represents how he sees this plan as something that the public is not able to have a seat at the table on. So things like that, not including the public, not responding to the public's concerns, make this kind of fight really frustrating for organizers, and make opposition incredibly difficult, because there is such a lack of transparency. But for workers, I mean, this fight means that workers who have been fighting for a living wage for years, who've already been fighting for to have a decent wage, now have to fight for their very jobs themselves. It means that workers, like at UT, on their lunch break or after their shift is over, they have to protest and they have to rally and share petitions to make sure that they have a job the next day. So it's an incredibly personal, incredibly difficult fight for these workers. And especially when this process has lacked any kind of transparency, it's really hard to know how to fight back when what you're fighting is constantly changing. But now, I guess you can just go through those photos. Sorry, I didn't really tell you. There's a couple photos of just campus workers at UT protesting. And there's like the Tennessee is not for sale hashtag. This is them at the Nashville State Capitol. And then 2 actions that the Campus Workers Union organized. Yeah. So at this point, now that the state has finalized a contract with JLL, it's really up to the individual university campuses and different facilities across the state to decide to opt in or out of this process. So now we've been focusing a lot on our university chancellor at UT, who is going to be making this decision, we think, in August. And Haslam has put a lot of pressure on these campuses, and he actually appointed every single member of the governing boards for 4-year state colleges. So I don't think that the cards could be any more stacked against state workers, but we are still hopeful that with more attention on this issue and more people fighting back against it, that we can stop thousands of jobs from being sold to the highest bidder. So yeah, I'll let Sam talk more.
Awesome. Thank you, Haley. For folks that missed it, I just want to recap that the 2 responses from Governor Haslam when pushed publicly about the plan have been, one, what plan? And the second one that Haley mentioned was when lawmakers drafted the bill, his opposition was a philosophical opposition. So you make of that what you will. Let me turn to Sam to talk about some of the sort of campaigns that have taken place. Can you talk about some of the successes that you all have experienced in organizing against privatization? Are there best practices that you might have for other folks?
Yeah, so, and I guess I'll just quickly preface this by saying that we really consider privatization as like not just selling off public goods, but really making government function as if it has to compete in the market and making government function like a business. Bringing in those kind of market mechanisms into government really is a form of privatization in our analysis. And so one recent success we had and kind of an expanding group of work that we're doing is our Tucson Coalition, all volunteers, retirees, students, donated staff time from union members, was in solidarity with Teamsters Local 104, which went on strike at the public bus system, Transdev, which is then owned by Veolia, one of the biggest transportation companies in the world and probably one of the more heinous outsourcing companies in the world. They were really able to build a really huge broad base of community support for the transit strike, which tend to have very harsh public reaction against them, and really build around the narrative that that buses are a public good, and as public goods, they should be both models of employment and function effectively, and that ultimately the workers were the experts as to whether they were functioning effectively or not. So the strike actually ended with the Tucson city government unanimously passed a resolution in support of the union, and there was a favorable contract in the end that included pay raises, moved to more stable hours, and things like that. And as we're expanding our transit work, we've really taken on it was started in LA, but the model of bus riders unions. So in Buffalo, Portland, and Long Island, where we have coalitions, and particularly on Long Island, where they're threatening full privatization of the bus lines, we're building up riders coalitions to work in solidarity with the workers who actually drive the buses and such to fight against privatization. In DC, we're currently part of a major push to stop privatization of WMATA, our kind of falling apart transit system, with the union's plan really actually gaining the most support, particularly in their proposal for a sales tax to fund the system, which currently has no dedicated funding. And then, of course, our Knoxville coalition has been heavily involved in Tennessee Not for Sale, and the point that Haley made about each school gets to choose whether they buy in or not to the contract, that was a concession that the campaign actually won from Haslam. Before, it was wholesale everything. And then finally, it's Justice for School Workers campaign, which we did a number of years ago in Atlanta, where we actually got school workers, bus drivers, pretty much all Atlanta public school employees, $8 million in unemployment back pay from the state of Georgia, and also reinstatement that summer was paid time, that they weren't laid off for the summer and then rehired, which is a favorite kind of education privatization scheme. And then really best practices, if you can't center workers in the campaign, then you don't have a campaign in our analysis. Both the workers whose jobs will be impacted, but also the workers who take the buses, who go to the schools, who eat the food. So Tennessee was led by groundskeepers and faculty. Atlanta was led by janitors and bus drivers. And so as we kind of build around these specific fights, we're really looking at how to bring in the community and workers so that they're not separated anymore by this idea that you're stopping a worker once you go home. We bring in people's churches so that they can have a kind of a broader, both moral argument, but also a broader base of support. And then, of course, the think tanks and research groups, whether national, like Employment Policy Institute, or locally, like the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, they can really help us target where the money's coming from, who has the power to ultimately give us what we want. And ultimately, our goal is to build a long-lasting coalition and a long-lasting relationships that set us up for the inevitable fight to come. So I hope that helped answer some questions.
Yes, absolutely, Sam. And for folks that may be tweeting this or want a quick soundbite, I can't recommend one more than, if you can't center workers in your campaign, then you do not have a campaign. So thank you so much for that, Sam. I think that sort of wraps it up in terms of all the questions I had. I want to turn to a couple of questions that we got from our audience. The first one, and I think Marshall, this may be a really good question for you to chime in on. Other panelists, of course, feel free to also hop in if you're interested. Carly is asking, she's asking whether the privatization of retirement plans, how has the shift away from pensions and towards the 401k affected workers?
Yeah, so that's really a dire trend, in my opinion. Basically, the risk in transferring from a defined benefit to a defined contribution retirement plan the risk is moved from a large group of employers or an entire plan to individuals. That is, the stock market goes up and down, and that means that your own retirement fund goes up and down, whereas in the past that really wouldn't affect you as an individual pension holder, maybe slightly, but if by pooling risk, you diffuse it across more individuals, and that really encapsulates the difference between private options.
Marshall, I think you've gone you're muted.
Oh, sorry. I apologize for that. My microphone has a strange mind of its own. And the other thing that I would say is that private pension plans also generally have a tax advantage that is much more valuable the richer that you are. So we have lots of tax shelters for retirement income, whether that's an employer plan or an individual plan, and those tax shelters are just, given that they're exempting you from taxation, if you pay a higher rate of taxes, that is to say, if you're richer, then the exemption is worth more, and consequently, these supposed incentives to save for retirement just don't matter to you if you're not rich. And consequently, we have the phenomenon in retirement in general where these private retirement plans have a ton of money in them, much more than defined benefit plans do. And at the same time, most people just have no money for retirement or very little saved for retirement. And that's because basically they are operating as tax shelters for the rich. And if you're rich, you have plenty of money in there, and rich people have more money than they've ever had before. So their tax exempt retirement plans have more money than they've ever had before. Meanwhile, we've had decades of wage stagnation, and the privatization of pension plans itself means that not rich people just don't have that much money to save for retirement, and the tax incentives are worth less for them, and consequently we have, I think we're heading into, if not already in, a retirement crisis through a really misguided public pension policy.
And just briefly to add to that, you know, what we know is that sort of the last frontier of the defined benefit pension plan is in public employee jobs. And so if those jobs get privatized, it's far easier to shift those workers into these 401k plans, which subsequently shifts risk onto them to be responsible for their own retirement. So the privatization issue and the 401k issue play very much hand in hand.
Absolutely. Thank you both. I'm going to just run through, and I know we're about 2 minutes or a minute to time, so I just want to make sure we run through some of the follow-ups. And then I do have one final question from a couple of folks that I want to run by, just to make sure folks that have to hop off have a chance to see some of the closeout follow-ups. If you're interested, or if your question wasn't raised, if you're interested in building an anti-privatization or a pro-public good campaign in your community, please get in touch. We have the resources and a sort of great desire to help you build one. This is the second of our three-part summer webinar series on the issue of privatization. Our first was on the issue of education privatization, and our third will be on the privatization of our justice systems. We will be sharing, if you missed any part of this and want to catch up, which I hope you will, we will be sharing the recording of this in a follow-up email, so you can absolutely use that as a way to catch up. And finally, again, I do want to stress that one of the big goals that we have here is not just to shift narratives, but actually to build projects and to build campaigns that will help counter this trend at the local level. So if you're interested in doing that, please get in touch, and we have a Republic project, a set of guides. It's on the tool that we call Loft that will guide you through how to do some of this. So if you have to hop off, thank you so much for being here. Let me go back and put one final question to our panelists. And it's sort of a little bit of a couple of questions. Rajiv and Claudia, thank you so much for your questions. So the question really focuses on what are the best accountability mechanisms for privatization, or what are the best accountability mechanisms more broadly for public goods? Is one potential way that was suggested to us is having labor clauses in all types of procurement contracts. Is that one potential solution? Are there others that come to mind? How can we ensure to build long-term structural policy solutions that can help counter this trend? And I'm sort of any panelist that wants to hop off, please do so.
Well,
all over.
If I can belabor my point even more, the best accountability mechanism is an organized workforce with those protections of a contract or some kind of bargaining agreement. So they can be the whistleblowers, they can be the kind of frontline accountability. And then the other part is having that public goods go deep into the community and deep in society, so people feel they need to defend it themselves. That's why, like in the UK right now, they've tried for 30 years to privatize the national health system, but they haven't been able to because people just like it too much. So I think those two. One's a bit more immediate for us here, but the other is definitely something could aspire to.
I guess what I would say about accountability mechanisms is just don't let people opt out. I think that that dynamic creates a sort of downward spiral of privatization where the idea is, oh, if you like the public good, then fine, but if there's some other private option that couldn't be either providing a more tailored service for your individual needs as a consumer, or that can exist alongside the public good, and everyone would be happy. And I think that really is just a way to get around the kind of community buy-in that exists for high quality public goods, especially when they're, I mean, in order to sustain such an endeavor, you need to talk to people as in all manner of their economic identities. So as consumers and workers and citizens, and if you kind of if you allow a menu of options to be offered up, you basically create a dynamic where you speak to citizens solely as consumers, and then when there's a campaign in which public sector workers or other citizens are saying, you know, this public good is important to us and we want to keep it in place, as a consumer you think, well, that doesn't matter to me, I already have this you know, through some other means because I opted for this other thing, and therefore I don't really care about the outcome of this campaign, and that is really death to any organizing drive. So I think in order to sustain a social movement that values public goods, you need essentially a mechanism to make sure that there's no way to opt out of them.
Yeah, well, if I could jump in, I guess what I have learned about from following this process in Tennessee for the past 2 years is that there is a frightening lack of different hoops that the government has to jump through in order to get to this stage in the outsourcing process. So there definitely needs to be more structural innovations to actually halt this kind of process from taking place again. Even just legislative oversight, the different attempts that our legislature has made to enact oversight at this stage in the process have failed. It's pretty clear that those stopgaps should have been in place a long time ago. And it's particularly important because a lot of states are looking at Tennessee right now and looking at the process that we've gone through and hoping to mimic it in their own states. So this is something that we could start seeing at a broader scale in a lot of different states. So yeah, looking at the things that Sam was talking about, and as well as legislative oversight, is definitely very important.
I could add something briefly, that there's a very interesting plan that's out of Los Angeles here, but it's nationwide, known as the U.S. Employment Plan. The question referenced something around procurement. The U.S. Employment Plan, and this is mostly involving rail infrastructure and bus infrastructure. It's saying that the companies who actually manufacture that equipment, the rail cars, the clean buses, things like that, they need to have a certain set of labor standards built into the mix, including unionized jobs, including the use of what would be known as at-risk or vulnerable communities, and the wide use of apprenticeships to get people who might normally not be able to get those jobs into them. This is a tremendous way to sort of leverage this capacity because, you know, the U.S., not just the U.S. government, but local governments and state governments have this tremendous purchasing power, and to be able to use that and make sure that when they're buying all this stuff on the open market, that they're doing it in support of very good jobs. It's related to the privatization issue. It's not exactly it, but you can see where you can, you know, take that idea and move it into the kinds of things that we saw, you know, at the tail end of the Obama administration with high road employment policies and, you know, things like that. There are good models out there that sort of, you know, take the stand that if our tax dollars being used to purchase something, that the people on the other side of that equation need to be well compensated.
All right.
And just to footnote that, look up Jobs to Move America if you're interested in the campaign that's really pushing that, which I'm also a part of.
Thanks for the full disclosure, Sam. Well, I want to stop here. I know there are still a number of folks that have remained on, even though we've gone sort of nearly 10 minutes over now, but I do want to give the panelists a break at this point, or not a break, but actually call an end to the session. But thank you so much to each one of you for being here. I think each of your expertise was very, very well received. I know I personally really enjoyed the ways in which you all played off each other and the ways in which your backgrounds all speak to different parts of this issue. So thank you all for being here. It was a real pleasure hearing from you. And finally, thank you to all the folks that joined us today. We really appreciate having you on. As mentioned, if you're interested in following up, please reach out to me. You should have my email, and we will be sharing a recording of this webinar in the follow-up email. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.